Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I'd like to introduce today's second panel.
Darius Watson is assistant professor at Bellevue University. He holds 4 degrees, including a master's in international relations and a PhD in political science and philosophy. Dr.
Thank
Watson.
you, Emil. Always seems to take a second for these to catch up here. So I suppose I should also begin with the perfunctory announcements early on. And so I should say off the top that my opinions only count for me and they do not represent the opinions of my wife in any way. I should also extend, to be honest, I'm beyond honored. There's a part of me that's almost been kind of starry-eyed here. It's amazing to see the number of people and the level of expertise represented in this room. In that regard, I have to extend a personal thank you to Michelle. Her name's been mentioned often, but the reality is I think the only reason I'm here is that she thought I was a cool professor. And so I am very happy to take advantage of that relationship as well. I'm probably going to disappoint you because I'm not going to come from a policy perspective here. I guess I should begin by saying that I was struck by the question of whether or not VEOs could be deterred. And my very first thought was that there might be some conceptual stretching going on. Specifically, my idea is that I'm wondering the degree to which VEO is a term that's developed because we can't figure out the fundamental differences between the Islamic State and traditional terrorist organizations. And so rather than really critically engaging those differences or trying to understand them relative to deterrence, we are trying in some way to label them in a way that will then allow us to apply already existing deterrence policies and strategies. My argument would be that that's not necessarily working. Fundamentally, I think as a political scientist and international security theorist in particular, most of us are well acquainted with Clausewitz's classic edict, war is the continuation of politics by other means. I think what is often overlooked is that even more terrorism, at least from a traditional perspective, was very much the continuation of politics by other means. And I think one of the fundamental differences between ISIL and most traditional terrorist organizations is that ISIL is not as beholden to the nation-state framework for rational decision-making as some of the other traditional organizations we've talked about. Specifically, I'm going to argue that there are 5 distinct differences between ISIL and traditional terrorist organizations, and that these differences fundamentally impact the ability to use existing or even potential deterrent strategies that might have worked against the traditional terrorist organizations against ISIL. The first one is motivation. I would argue that the large majority of organizations that have been talked about, both contemporary and in a traditional sense, had political motivations on some level. It tended to revolve around the adoption, disruption, or replacement of an existing regime within a recognized territory. In other words, the very foundation of their interests was based upon the frameworks that are associated with nation-state cognitive decision-making frameworks. This meant that their development of their interests and their goals also tended to be somewhat similar to those which would be adopted by a nation-state. The difference that I see in ISIL is that they have religious motivations rather than political. And why is that? It seems very obvious and distinct, but to me the difference is that political motivations for traditional terrorist organizations at least created the possibility of negotiation. I'm not seeing that with regards to the development and operations of ISIL. There is no future, let's get around the table and figure out how to all kind of get along. And that, to me, really kind of begins to cast doubt on or reduce the effectiveness of traditional mechanisms that we might use to counter these sorts of organizations. In other words, I'm questioning whether or not, from a political standpoint, that there's a cost-benefit analysis that they're making that says, no matter how much I want this goal, it's no longer worth it from a political standpoint. From a religious standpoint, you can continue to argue all the way through death that it was worth it, because it's the idea itself that is righteous and not necessarily its recognition by other members of the community. A second aspect, and this has been brought up both on this panel and the previous panel, a key aspect of terrorist activities, especially with regards to insurgency activities and traditional understandings of terrorism, traditional terrorist groups very much needed to rely on soft power. Specifically, a key component of terrorist activities and goals was the degree to which they could create sympathy within the communities that they were operating. This was especially important with regards to those terrorist organizations which were putting themselves out there as representatives or champions, if you will, of certain groups, to then go back and not try and develop sympathy amongst those groups would almost be antithetical to what the group was trying to accomplish. Why do I think ISIL is different? ISIL has utilized violence and just mass attacks against its own people on a level that I'm not sure I could see within any other terrorist group that I've studied. Now, other terrorist groups are very often willing to use extreme violence against groups that they see as discriminating against them or as oppressing them. But it's usually no sale for a terrorist group to begin attacking its own people, so to speak. And so to me, there seems to be a different methodology, a different rationale behind the ISIL's use of violence. And that rationale is not political in my mind, it's religious, which in turn, again, limits the degree to which we're going to be able to negotiate or maybe even deter those behaviors. A third idea is that it would seem to me, and again, this is very much just my own opinion, traditional terrorist organizations very much in one way or another revolved around acquisition or control of territory on some level. Yes, there was always a political or an ideological position or foundation of what it was they were trying to accomplish. But in the end, it was about acquiring a territory which they could then use as a sanctuary to further promote or develop their ideological position. ISIL, I would argue, is different precisely because territory is a means to an end and not an end to itself. The territory, as far as I can see with regards to the activities of ISIL, is simply a stepping stone or an empowerment that then allows them to further expand their ideological push in other areas. There's been a lot of discussion, for instance, about how could we possibly deter ISIL in Syria? What does it mean for destabilization in the Middle East? I find it interesting how quickly we can forget that they've been tagged with over 200 attacks in 20 different countries around the world. There are entire other organizations that have pledged allegiance to them. Again, this seems to me to indicate that ISIL is operating on an entirely different level than what we understand traditional terrorist organizations to be. Fourth, when we talk about the use of terrorism, especially in conjunction with insurgencies, there is a natural increase in the need for the insurgent group or the terrorist group to become more aware or at least respondent to norms, traditions, and rules of the international system as they get closer to success. Primarily because, again, one of their goals was to take over or in some other way acquire a regime in the territory associated with it. And so once they acquire that position, it's really important that they maintain some sort of positive viewpoint with regards to the international system. So what you see is a reduction in some traditional uses of terrorist activity against groups as success comes closer. Because if they achieve success to be who they want to be within the international system, a recognized even member or equal member, they have to be seen on some level as adhering to the international system's laws and rules and norms. I would argue that ISIL has not only turned this on its head, but it actually looks at it almost in reverse. Rather than seeing the increase in viability of cause directly related to perhaps their greater attention or sympathy towards the international system and its norms, I would argue that ISIL, in fact, sees the viability of its cause as being directly related to its ability to attack and destroy those systems. And so in a very way, there is no intention on the part of ISIL to in any way tailor their message or their activities to become a member of the community. In fact, it would seem to me that their entire goal here is to blow up the community, both literally and figuratively, from a normative perspective. And this, again, makes it much more difficult for us to apply traditional deterrence techniques because they're not going to respond to both denial and punishment deterrence in the same way as someone who was operating primarily on political interests would. Finally, most traditional terrorist organizations had somewhat limited capability, and the capability obviously is limited by things like technology, but one of the significant sources of limitation on the capability of traditional terrorist organizations was their recruitment pool, and the degree to which most of their recruitment had to take place within a specific population or specific territory, often directly related to whatever their political goals were relative to the regime controlling that territory. ISIL has again broken the mold in this regard because their recruiting practices are worldwide. As much as they've been implicated in attacks in 20 different countries around the world, they've also been identified as having more than 100 different nationalities associated in various ways with various operations around the world. This again seems to indicate to me that they are moving beyond the somewhat bounded and traditional understandings of political interests that have driven traditional terrorist organizations in the past. Forgive me for the kind of devolution here into political theory, but it seems to me that they're attacking modernity itself, that they see fundamentally the existence of a West as a threat to what they believe to be the reality. And so any attempts on the part of the West to get them to understand that we can get along, I can't help but think that they're going to fall on deaf ears. So I guess the primary point I'm trying to make here is that I absolutely agree with Bob's argument that these terrorist organizations are not irrational. And I think when we see the level of bloodshed and just absolute destruction that they're visiting on us and our allies, our thought process goes to the understanding that maybe they are irrational, they're crazy. I think what we need to really kind of begin engaging here is that they're rational, they're just using what I would call a pre-modern rational decision-making framework. And going back and reading some history, I was struck by the degree to which some of the rhetoric that you hear coming out of ISIL and similar extremist Islamic organizations they're mirrored by the statements and different comments that you see in individuals leading the Islamic group during the Crusades. And it really is a return in many ways to kind of this traditional, what I call a war of annihilation. A lot of discussions, and an interesting article I've read recently refers to modern war as war of disruption. You're looking to disrupt your enemy to the point that they're willing to give in on whatever it is you're trying to ask for. I would argue that the West has spent basically the last 500 years through the development of international norms, rules, laws, institutions, alliances. We've done everything we can to ensure that the West never engages in another war of annihilation. It's one of the reasons why the Holocaust had such an absolute impact on the understanding of the West and how we engage in war, because we ultimately did not want to ever see something like that again. So I guess my argument is that I think they're not going to be deterred, but I think it's because they're using a decision-making framework in terms of rational choice that we are no longer familiar with in the West. Further, I'm not sure we want to be familiar with it. And so this brings up a lot of really interesting thoughts and questions, and so I'll kind of draw to a close here by discussing the question of stabilization issues. I'm not going to try and rehash some of the other comments made about specific tactical and strategic stability within the Middle East. I think that's been covered quite a bit. What I find interesting to consider here is the degree to which our reactions to their activities may stabilize or destabilize. And what I mean by that is I wonder the degree to which we need to begin, and I think we've already done it to a degree, putting some of our standards and morals and ethical guidelines to the side in order to defeat these people. And the question becomes, how much do we lose of ourselves as a society, as a culture, as a civilization, in order to defeat them? So, for instance, I see already, whether we're talking about targeted killings, unrestricted drone warfare, a variety of other issues and topics, the reality is that those things are only being done because we're fighting terrorists, not because that's suddenly become an acceptable tactic or use of the weapons system. And so how much are we going to begin justifying the violation of our own morals, ethics, and rules in order to destroy the people that are attacking our morals, ethics, and rules? And so for me, the stabilization question isn't really a question of what ISIS will be able to do to destabilize the international system. In my mind, it's the degree to which our reactions and the things that we're willing to do and how that might destabilize the international system in the long run. Thank you very much.
So we have a bunch of questions. One really doesn't have much to do with ISIS or terrorism, but so I will raise that for someone to address it. Is from Lieutenant Dobro from Malmstrom Air